The American Civil War is the deadliest conflict in the history of the United States. Between 650 to 750,000 people lost their lives, 2% of the entire American population at the time, and almost as much as every other war America has been in combined. The Union flipped the odds to pull off an incredible victory over the Confederacy. This, however, could not have been done without the most important battle of the war. So, a bit of background. The year is 1863, and the Union performance in the war up to this point had been, to put it mildly, atrocious. The Confederate armies of Northern Virginia, under a certain Robert E. Lee, were coming off an astounding victory at the Battle of Chancellorsville. One fighting man, a fighting Joe to be exact, despite great strategy, had led the Union into an embarrassing defeat. Both troop morale and public support were at an all-time low for the Union, leaving President Abraham Lincoln in quite the pickle. Lee figured that if he could march north into Union soil and win one more decisive victory over the Army of the Potomac, that would be game over. Not to mention that the Confederates still naively hoped that they could find a military alliance with a Western European power if they showed military dominance over the Union. In addition to that, the Confederates were also in desperate need of supplies. They lacked clothes, shoes, and food, and since Virginia's landscape was ravaged by the war, its crop yield and manufacturing output weren't exactly ideal. So, since they didn't have access to supplies, they decided to go get some. And what better a place to win the war than good old Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania has a lot of stuff. They have the Amish, cheesesteaks, and most importantly, farmland. Lots of farmland. Lee marched north through Maryland and into the Susquehanna Valley. The embarrassed Union Army under Hooker followed him until Hooker's command was called into question, and then he resigned. And then the embarrassed Union Army under a new character, George Meade, followed Lee. The Union wasn't really looking for a fight, eager to try and avoid another Chancellorsville. Meade is in a tough spot right now, in which he can't let Lee run free in the heartland of the North, but he also has to stay between Lee and the capital for fear of government capitulation. Lee relied on his cavalrymen, led by Jeb Stuart, to try and hide Lee's advance into the North. They did this by wreaking havoc on the Union supply lines, until communication was lost, leaving Lee without any intel on the whereabouts of the Union Army. That was until spies were able to provide him with the information that Meade was approaching fast, really fast. Lee ordered his army to make good use of the southern Pennsylvania transportation network, which led to a certain hub with roads and railroads sprawling in all directions. See, it might not be such a big deal now, but back in the 1860s, railroads were a really big deal in warfare. No railroads meant no efficient supply lines, and that meant attrition-infected armies. It was a big deal to Lee to conquer this railroad hub. He had ordered his army to prepare for battle at Gettysburg. It's July 1st, 1863. The Union and Confederate armies in the Eastern Theater have met once again, this time in the small college town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Confederate General Henry Heth has taken an infantry division north to Gettysburg in the hopes of finding some supplies that they could use. What they actually found was slightly disappointing to expectations. Major General John Buford. 2 cavalry brigades of Buford had been stationed in Gettysburg unexpecting of a Confederate attack. The Confederates had first thought it was an emergency militia, but that became evidently false early on. Buford and his horses did a great job of defending against Heth until Union reinforcements, an infantry division under command of John Reynolds, arrives. Not long after, Confederate Generals A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell sent reinforcements from the 2nd and 3rd Corps to the battle. This might be a good time to talk about command in the Confederate Army at the time. The armies of Northern Virginia, prior to Gettysburg, were divided into 2 corps. The first was under command of Robert Lee, and the second was under command of the man, the myth, the legend, Stonewall Jackson. Jackson had recently been killed by his own men in a friendly fire incident at Chancellorsville, leaving the Confederate 2nd Corps without their leader. They split into the 2nd and 3rd Corps, with Richard Ewell replacing Jackson in the second and A.P. Hill taking over the third. Now, back to the battle. Reinforcements from Ewell and Hill arrive at the scene. The first battle at Gettysburg was kind of like a school fight, where the feud starts between two people, and as the intensity increases, more and more people join each side. One of the reasons Buford's men did so well in the beginning is that they were recently issued some super sweet high-tech new rifles a few weeks earlier, using these to their advantage. The Confederates chased Buford and Reynolds back to McPherson Ridge, where a new line of Union infantry was awaiting their arrival. The following battle was ferocious, and thousands of casualties were sustained on both sides. John Reynolds was tragically shot in the action. This battle, however, gave Union troops the chance to retreat and fall back to Cemetery Hill, where they could gather reinforcements and prepare for the incoming attack. July 2nd was to be the bloodiest day of the battle, and by itself would rank as the 10th bloodiest battle of the whole war. Over 20,000 men lost their lives from both sides. But back to the scene. The Union armies had been given time to reorganize themselves and set up in a formation, one that kind of resembles a fishhook, and was appropriately named the Fishhook Formation. Now, wherever the Confederates attacked, Meade would easily be able to reinforce a sector that was under pressure. One Confederate general, and at the time Lee's best general, was James Longstreet, who knew how to rock a beard. Longstreet had participated in the Battle of Fredericksburg, where he had defeated this guy in the worst military defeat in American history. He was Lee's right-hand man. Longstreet's First Corps, mentioned earlier, were given the task of flanking the weakened Union left. In war, when an enemy flanks you, they can put you in danger of encirclement. At the end of the Union fishhook were two areas named Little and Big Round Top. Lee noticed that these hills were left undefended, and so decided to go attack them. Thankfully, one Gouverneur Warren, a brigadier general, noticed this possible catastrophe. Colonel Strong Vincent deployed a mere 1,300 men under one Joshua Chamberlain to defend the high ground of the Round Tops. Joshua Chamberlain was not a military man. In fact, he didn't even go to West Point or fight in the Mexican-American War, one such trait that many Civil War generals had. Both his great-grandfather and his grandfather fought in wars for America, but he was a professor. At the start of the war, he volunteered for the Union and quickly rose through the ranks, and by Gettysburg was a commander of a whole regiment. Brutal fighting followed at the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, and the Round Tops, with Chamberlain's men doing their best to combat the Confederate sharpshooters in the rocks of Devil's Den. After an hour of fighting, Chamberlain had exhausted all of his ammunition. Normally, this would call for a retreat, but not for Chamberlain. "Sir, I think we should retreat." Heck no! Unheard of in military strategy at the time, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge at Longstreet's corps, which forced them to retreat, leaving the Union victorious. This battle was some of the most vicious of the entire Gettysburg campaign, and thousands lost their lives. That was not all of the second day though. Back at the other end of the fishhook, Confederate forces under Ewell continued to attack the Union, creating gaps, with attack after counterattack taking a heavy toll on both sides. By the end of the day, Union troops held firm on both sides, retaking all the land they lost. You thought this battle was over? Well, think again, my friend. Lee had attacked both the left and right flanks of the fishhook, but not yet the center. Lee thought Meade would use his reinforcements to help out the flanks, but he also should have thought again. And so, Lee drew up plans for an all-out charge on the Union position at Cemetery Ridge. A full-on charge with over 15,000 men over a mile of unprotected, wide-open farmland in broad daylight? What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, everything. "Sir, this is a horrible idea. We should retreat." Heck no! At the start of the afternoon, an inconceivable amount of Confederate artillery guns opened barrage on the Union lines with the hopes of crushing their infantry and silencing their artillery. If you haven't picked up already, 1860s weaponry wasn't very accurate. Very few Confederate shells actually hit their targets, and many sailed short and overhead. The Union responded to this by unleashing their own artillery barrage, until commanders reminded them that they should conserve ammo to decimate the incoming attack. The artillery barrage was so large that there were reports of it being heard all the way in Pittsburgh. After this, 15,000 Confederate soldiers under command of George Pickett, who also thought this was a horrible idea, jumped over their fences and ran into what would become known as Pickett's Charge. As they pushed closer and closer to the Union lines, the artillery guns began to tear them to shreds. Well-placed canister shots blew huge gaps in the Confederate formation, killing dozens at a time. Add the thousands of rifles that were firing at point-blank range, and you get a recipe for a complete bloodbath. Some of Pickett's men made it over the fence, where ferocious melee combat ensued. They seemed to be breaking through the lines until Union reinforcements were able to push them back. Lee knew at this point that all hope was lost. The very few who survived the charge walked back to their line exhausted. Lee was reported to have been claiming fault for the disaster after his men walked back. The Battle of Gettysburg was by far the bloodiest in American history to this day. All in all, 50,000 casualties were sustained by both sides. July 4th of 1863 was a day spent cleaning up the wounded and burying some of the dead. The Confederates were hoping for a counterattack by the Union, one which never came. Meade decided not to push the Confederates as his army had also taken a huge blow. Had he pushed and destroyed the retreating Confederates, the war likely would have been over. Lee and his men led a 27-mile-long hospital train on retreat back to Virginia. They couldn't cross the Potomac as the river was flooded at the time, but by the time the Union got there, they'd made it across. Lee's second attempt at invading the North had failed miserably. That November, Edward Everett was invited to give a speech to a crowd of thousands at a ceremony regarding Gettysburg. His speech lasted 2 hours. President Lincoln was also invited to give some short dedicatory remarks at the end of the day. Lincoln's 3-minute Gettysburg address would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. It honored those who served in Gettysburg while bringing the nation together as one. The Battle of Gettysburg truly was a turning point in the Civil War. From here on out, the odds were flipped on the Union side, and they would go on to win the war 2 years later. To all who served in the Battle of Gettysburg and the war as a whole, lest we forget.